I'm Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the museum, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's inaugural New York Jewish Book Festival. This event is on Squirrel Hill, the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting, and the Soul of a Neighborhood with Mark Oppenheimer. We hope you will explore the 32 events that are happening throughout the museum today, meet some of the 85 speakers, and get books signed at one of the 72 author signings in our main lobby and events hall on the second floor. While you are here, we also encourage you to take the time to visit our exhibitions, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, on the main level, and Survivors' Faces of Life After the Holocaust, photographs by Martin Scholler, on the third floor, which is where we are. Andy Goldsworthy's Garden of Stones is also worth a visit, just outside of our wonderful Cafe Locks, so the whole museum is open to you today. You can also pick up holiday gifts and books at the Pickman Museum shop and visitor services on the main level. We're encouraging people to wear masks in the museum, and we hope you will share feedback with us in our post-festival survey, which will be in your inboxes tomorrow. This program is made possible in part by support from the Battery Park City Authority. Your donations also help us present these programs, and this event is co-presented by New York Jewish Week. And now I'm glad to introduce you to our speaker. Mark Oppenheimer is the author of 5 books, including Knocking on Heaven's Door, American Religion in the Age of Counterculture, and the Newish Jewish Encyclopedia. He was the religion columnist for the New York Times from 2010 to 2016 and has written for numerous publications. The host of Tablet Magazine's podcast Unorthodox, Oppenheimer has taught at Stanford, Wellesley, and Yale, where since 2006 he has directed the Yale Journalism Initiative. Squirrel Hill, the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting, and the Soul of a Neighborhood is available for purchase in our Pickman Museum shop and lobby, and Mark will sign copies for half an hour after the event in the resource area in the events hall on the second floor. Now please welcome Mark Oppenheimer.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. Thank you all for turning out. This view is incredible. I think, how am I going to focus on Tree of Life when I'm looking at the best view I've ever seen? I had no idea. No idea what I was getting myself into. So thank you so much. We have just passed, in October, the 4th anniversary of the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history, October 27th, 2018. What I would like to do with all of you today is I'm going to share a few minutes about how I came to write this book, and then I just want to run through about a dozen slides of photographs from the book, because the book is very, very richly illustrated, as I really felt it was important. As much as I like to think that my words paint pictures, really pictures paint pictures. So I included a lot of photographs from the day, the week, the month, and the year after that shooting. But let me tell you how I came to write the book, and that'll also give you a sense of what the book is about. October 27th, 2018, I was not at my home synagogue in New Haven, Connecticut. Rather, I was in Newton, Massachusetts at Temple Emmanuel, very, very large conservative shul in Newton, for the bat mitzvah of one of my eldest daughter's summer camp friends from Camp Ramah in Palmer, Massachusetts. And we were in shul the whole morning, 9:30 to after lunch, I would say 1 o'clock. And I did not have my phone with me. We had driven up that morning, and but we try to be as Shabbos observant as possible, at least within the synagogue. So we had no idea what was going on in Pittsburgh. And while it was certainly the case that there were people in the synagogue who must have known, because there were hundreds of people there, including plenty of non-observant people, lots of people were checking their phones. Nobody told us what was going on. And we didn't find out about it until I got back out to my car afterwards. And then I did turn on my phone to check in with my wife, see how things were going back on the home front. And I had all of these texts from people saying, are you going to Pittsburgh? Did you hear about Pittsburgh? What are we going to do about Pittsburgh? And I had no idea what I was talking about. Now, as it happens, my dad is from Pittsburgh, so this wasn't the craziest thing in the world. It's entirely possible that people who knew that I had Pittsburgh heritage or roots, which is not something I'm shy about, might have thought that I would have some response to something going on in Pittsburgh, but I didn't know what that thing was. So I navigated over to whatever news app I had, and I then saw what had happened. And I must have looked very, very ashen or shaken, because my daughter, who again was then, I want to say 11, who was seated next to me in the car in the passenger seat, said, "Dad, what's wrong?" And I said, "Well, there's been a shooting at a synagogue in Squirrel Hill." And she said, "Dad, isn't that where we're from?" Now, this was an extraordinary thing for her to say because while it is true that my dad is from the Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh, he's lived in Springfield, Massachusetts since 1975, and that's the only way I know him, and it's the only way my children know their grandpa is as someone from Western Massachusetts. I had no idea that Rebecca knew that grandpa was from Pittsburgh or knew that, how could she have known that he was from this particular neighborhood? But somehow the family lore had worked its way down to her. And I said, yes. I said, in fact, that is right. That is where we're from. So I then had to go figure out, was this in fact my relative's synagogue that had been hit? And it wasn't. None of them belonged to Tree of Life. But I spent the next day or two or three grappling with the fact that this place that had played such an important part in my own family's history in America, because there have been Oppenheimers in Squirrel Hill as long as there has been really Squirrel Hill. It was settled around the time of World War I, and my ancestors, who had been in Pittsburgh since the 1840s, moved from downtown, moved east to Squirrel Hill, as lots of Jews were moving east to Squirrel Hill around 1918, 1919. What to make of the fact that this neighborhood, which had been a safe place to be Jewish, and indeed a delightful place to be Jewish for about 100 years, was now the site of this extremely horrific act, that it would forevermore be known as the place where 11 Jews were killed that day. And I wrestled a lot with that. Because Squirrel Hill, keep in mind, isn't just a historical Jewish neighborhood. It has been about a third Jewish for a century. It is the, I would argue, and I think I'm right about this, though demographers have battled me on this, I think it's the most stable Jewish neighborhood in American history. It's been sort of 25 to 35% Jewish for about a century exactly. And that's actually not something you can say of Brookline or Newton or Skokie or Beverly Hills or, Great Neck. Most of these places weren't Jewish until after World War II, or if they were Jewish, like the Lower East Side, they have largely ceased to be Jewish. But Squirrel Hill has held a particular character for about a century, which I think makes it a fairly special place. And what this also meant was that there was a certain set of questions you could ask about mass killings that would get specific and interesting answers by looking at a place like Squirrel Hill. We live in the era of mass killings in America, which I think, to be fair, people would agree was inaugurated by the Columbine shooting in 1999. So if you're a college senior today, you basically were born right after the Columbine killings, and you've never not known an era of mass killings in America. And since the Columbine shootings, there have been something like 400 or 500 mass killings, which the FBI defines, in fact, as a shooting incident in which 4 or more people are killed. There's a special FBI category for what counts as a mass killing. And as a reporter, I do have a set of questions about what makes certain communities thrive. I've always been very interested in neighborhoods. And it occurred to me here that you had a confluence of all these interesting things that were coming up in American history. One, rising anti-Semitism. Number two, mass killings. But number three, the question of why certain neighborhoods are resilient or sound or integrated or coherent or stable or have opportunities for solidarity and allyship, and why certain neighborhoods aren't. So I live 20 miles from Newtown. The Sandy Hook killing was, in a sense, in my backyard. We have friends whose son was inside the building and survived. And that, of course, is a place where famously the community in some ways came apart. And it came apart partly because of Alex Jones and all sorts of malefactors from the outside. But it's also a sprawling suburban community where a lot of the parents didn't necessarily know each other. In Squirrel Hill, I knew from the moment I heard about the killing that this was going to be a community where everyone knew the dead and where the dead and their families tended to know each other. Not just because it occurred at a house of worship, which, by the way, is actually, interestingly, the exception in American mass killings. Very few houses of worship have been targeted. But also because Squirrel Hill is a very, very special place. It's a place where within 1 square mile you have a whole bunch of synagogues and churches and the public library and the kosher butcher and the public high school and the bookstore and the supermarket and the Judaica store, everything. It's walkable, people bump into each other. And so everybody knows everybody and everybody's in each other's business. It's also religiously integrated, not just across religions, but across denominations. So it's one of those rare neighborhoods in America where the Orthodox Jews and the Reform Jews live together, as well as all the other flavors, which, as you know, tends to be fairly exceptional. So while initially I thought, I don't want to write about this, and everyone was asking me, are you going to go to Pittsburgh? Because I cover American religion, I've been doing so for a long time. Initially I thought, I don't want to write about mass death. It's never anything I've written about. over the course of the next week or 2 weeks, I realized there was actually a whole set of questions that Squirrel Hill would help me answer. And so I began going, and I ended up going to Pittsburgh 32 times over 18 months. I finished my reporting as it happened just before COVID descended across the land. And I interviewed about 250 people, including, the florists who, helped people grieve, including people who baked for the Shivas, including rabbis, lay people, massage therapists who help people cope with their trauma, people who knew the dead, people who didn't know the dead. I tried to get a sense, 360-degree sense of how everybody in the neighborhood is impacted, and basically what it does to a neighborhood. What happens after the mass media leaves? After NBC and the New York Times have gone, what's the neighborhood like? And that's the book I wrote. And while people always say, was this a sad book? I say, no. It was about a sad event, but for reasons that I actually hope all of you will understand, it's a fairly hopeful book. So let me take you through about a dozen scenes from the book, and then I really want to take your questions. The first thing I want to start with is the cover jacket, which it didn't occur to me until after the book was already printed. What a beautifully chosen image this is, because it's the sort of spontaneous memorial garden that arose outside of Tree of Life. This is probably about 48 hours after the killing. And as you can see, it's a bunch of candles and also a bunch of flowers. And it only occurred to me after the book was printed, as I said, what an interesting demonstration this is of the interfaith response to the killing, because Jews don't tend to do flowers, right? What do we do for our dead? We light candles and we put stones on graves. But Christians like flowers. Flowers are very Christian, and candles are very Jewish. We use candles for everything, to bring in holidays, to leave holidays, to honor the dead. So the fact that within a couple days, the site of grief and mourning outside the synagogue had already become a place where you had the Christian symbolism of the dead and the Jewish symbolism struck me as a very, very important thing to keep in mind, as Squirrel Hill, remember, is majority non-Jewish. This is Gregory Zanis. Some of you will have known who he is. He was featured on 60 Minutes and NPR. Until his death in December of 2020, he had traveled the country for about 25 years as part of a nonprofit, a one-man nonprofit called Crosses for Losses. And he would drive around the country to the site of mass death, either mass shootings or tornadoes or plane crashes, but principally mass killings. And he would put these crosses in the ground in honor of the dead. He was an evangelical Christian. But something he did was, if he knew the dead weren't Christian, he would try to modify the crosses to honor whatever religion they were from. So he actually pulled up in front of Tree of Life with a bunch of lumber in the back of his truck, having driven all night. This is a man who put 4 million miles on 15 different trucks over 20 years. And he always, as he said, I travel with lumber and my Home Depot credit card. And he got to the front of Tree of Life, and he actually bumped into a Jewish person, and he said, can you give me the names of the dead? And Tammy Hepps, this is one of the first scenes from my book, actually had the names of the dead on her phone. This is about a day after, this is the Sunday after the killings. And her mother had emailed her the article about the press conference where they'd announced the 11 who died. Because remember, nobody knew who was dead and who was missing. And there were 22 people inside, 11 got out alive, 11 died. So there were all these rumors, and people thought they knew who was dead, who wasn't. But Tammy had on her phone the actual names of the 11 dead. And she told him the names, and he then took out his black paint and he painted their names on 11 different stars of David. And he affixed the Magen David to the front of the crosses. And you're going to see what I mean in just a moment. But again, this is in keeping with the way that an interfaith response and a Gentile response characterizes a closely knit Jewish and non-Jewish neighborhood. One of the things I was very interested in was visual culture, because again, if the question I'm asking is, how does the neighborhood feel different a week or a month or a year after the killings? One of the ways it will feel different is, what visual reminders are there of the killings that weren't there before? Who here has seen this image, by the way? Okay, almost all of you. So this, of course, is the Pittsburgh Steelers football logo with the yellow Star of David replacing what is on the logo, a yellow, do we have any geometry professors here? It's a yellow that's a hypocycloid. So the red and blue hypocycloids usually have a yellow hypocycloid at the top. It is replaced in this, which is a kind of asteroid, which is a kind of star. There's a geometric formula for how you generate one. But a graphic designer named Tim Hines, not spelled like the ketchup. Heinz Ketchup is a big Pittsburgh company, but he's not of that family, who was a Lutheran American, German American, Protestant guy who lived in the Pittsburgh suburbs, graphic designer, went home the afternoon of the killing and thought, I've got to do something. I've got to do something to help these Jews. He didn't know the Jews. He lived 20 miles from the Jews. He wasn't like part of a Jew-adjacent community. He was just a Gentile dude from the suburbs who sat down at his MacBook and opened it up and thought, how can I make an image that shows that Pittsburgh loves its Jews? So he thought, what's Pittsburgh? He thought, the Steelers logo. And what's Jewish? And he thought, I think there's this thing called a Star of David. And he created this image. Then he replaced the word Steelers with stronger than hate, which is a play on other motifs from mass killings like Boston Strong, Orlando Strong. And then he posted it to Facebook. And to make a long story short, within a day, it had been shared millions of times. He actually put it open access into the world. He said anyone can use it for free. And people were holding it up at the Steelers game the next day. It then became a poster that you saw in shop windows along Forbes and Murray Avenue in Squirrel Hill. You saw it on babies' onesies. You saw it on yarmulkes. You saw it probably on cloth diapers. Who knows? It became the defining image. And again, created by a non-Jewish, German, Lutheran American graphic designer from the suburbs. One of my final bits of mass culture, because I could talk about visual culture forever. It's my secret hobby. This is, I don't know if you can see it from your angle, this is the headline from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the Friday after the killing. So the fourth consecutive day of funerals. There were funerals from Tuesday to the Friday. And the Post-Gazette editor, David Shribman, who is Jewish, decided to print the first line of the mourner's Kaddish on top of as his big headline. So that says, Yit Gadal v'Yit Gadash Shemei Rabbah. The very shrewd among you will note that one letter is wrong, but that doesn't matter. He copped to that, right? The final letter, I think, is a hey, and it should be an aleph, right? So anyway, he claimed only 3 people wrote to him to complain. He said 3 Orthodox guys wrote to me to complain. But anyway, David Shribman got this idea for doing this bit of visual culture. He realized most of his readers would have including many of the Jewish readers, would have no idea what this was. But he decided to do it. He called his rabbi from Temple Sinai, and he said, could you email me the first line of the Kaddish? So his rabbi emailed it to him. I don't think David reads Hebrew, so I don't think David knew if it was right or not. But then David had to go to his typesetter at the Post-Gazette, his graphic designer, and say, could you put this on top? And they said, we don't have a Hebrew font that big. I mean, no, I don't think in the history of American newspapers, an English language newspaper had ever run a Hebrew headline. So they had to mock up, they had to basically create a Hebrew font on the fly and make this large headline. And of course, when it dropped the next day, Friday morning, at the newsstands, in the kiosks, at people's front doors, people were just devastated. I mean, people just picked it up and started sobbing because it was so perfect. And it's become one of the iconic pieces of newspaper art in American history. What's also more American than the Starbucks? This is one of 2 Starbucks in Squirrel Hill. This is the one at the corner of Forbes and Shady. And these bits of window art, you can see it's a Star of David, a Tree of Life, and a dove. We're early in the Torah cycle, so the dove is kind of in the front of our mind, right? Were painted along with Hebrew words, ahava, chesed, tikva, in these windows at this Starbucks that is frequented by observant Jews who live in Squirrel Hill, where the Gentile managers know what's kosher and what's not kosher. There's a whole, by the way, subfield on the internet of what's kosher at Starbucks. I once wrote an article about this. There are people who blog about this religiously, so to speak. And but the manager of this Starbucks, Melissa Lysott, raised Presbyterian in the Pittsburgh suburbs, grew up not knowing Jews, but grew to love her Jewish customers, and she thought, we have to do something for these customers. This Starbucks, by the way, people were taking refuge in this Starbucks the morning of the killings when the police cars were coming from everywhere and the sirens. And this is about less than half a mile from Tree of Life. It's 2 long blocks away. And people were huddling in the Starbucks. So she thought, we have to do something for them. And she called her friend, Nicole Flannery, as you can guess from the name, not a Jew, Roman Catholic, local artist and art teacher, and said, would you do something in the windows? And Nicole consulted with some Jews whom she met, and they came up with this Jewish art. And it's still there to this day, 4 years later. It's on the inside, so it doesn't wash away in the weather. And I just love the idea that 30 years from now, there will be kids at the tables in Starbucks sipping their seasonal frappuccinos, pumpkin spice, and saying, what is that art? And people will have reason to tell them the story of the Tree of Life synagogue shooting. If you see the H here, and I promise I'll move on from visual culture in a minute, but I'm just obsessed. If you see the H, there's a little tinsel paper Star of David hanging from it. There were thousands of these throughout Pittsburgh. There was a Facebook group that collected these from around the world. Children did most of them, popsicle sticks, paper mache, glitter paper. Some of them were knit, crocheted, and they were just a group of mostly women organized through this Facebook group, fanned out across Pittsburgh and hung these little Stars of David, which had messages about the dead written on them, from statuary, from road signs, etc. Most of them didn't survive the winter, but this one did. I found this one in March, and I took this picture. And the next week when I was in Pittsburgh, I found this one in the mud. It had finally snapped and fallen, and so I saved it myself. This photograph is interesting because, as you can see, it's a group of observant men, Orthodox presenting men, following a hearse with one of the dead. Why is this important? Well, none of the dead was Orthodox practicing. They had been inside so there were three, as you know, there were three congregations that lost members that day. There was the Tree of Life congregation, which owned the building, and they lost 7 members. But they had 2 tenant congregations. One of them was a Reconstructionist congregation, Dor Chadash, which lost 1 member. And then there was another conservative congregation called New Light, which lost 3 members. So the 11 dead came 7, 3, and 1 from 3 different congregations, but none of them Orthodox. And yet, here are a bunch of Orthodox men acting as shomrim, acting as guards, accompanying the dead body to the cemetery. People talk so much about interfaith in America. This is intrafaith. These are frommer Jews helping less observant, less frum Jews, or less traditionally Orthodox Jews with their grieving. And by the way, my favorite chapter in this book is about the Chevra Kadishas, it's about the burial societies. There were 2 burial societies in Pittsburgh that did the taharas, the ritual cleaning of the body. One of them is, they don't like it if I use this term, but one of them really is for Orthodox Jews, and one of them is a more liberal Chevra Kadisha and includes people who are not maybe halachically Jewish because they had a reform or conservative conversion, and so forth and so on. So there are two Chevra Kadishas. Both of them collaborated to bury the clean, sew into linen shrouds, put in the pine boxes, and bury these bodies. And not just that. When there's a mass killing with bloodshed and with bullet wounds, one of the things that happens is that a lot of human tissue, brain matter, bone, hair, gets embedded in walls and spilled across the floor. And it's a mitzvah, it's a Jewish commandment that all of the body has to be buried. So among the work that these groups, the men's Chevra Kadishas, the women's Chevra Kadishas, these are 4 groups really, had to do was to collect all of this tissue and give it a proper burial in its own grave. It was extraordinary work. And this is just, there won't be photographs of any of that because this work is done privately and secretly, but which is part of the tradition, is you don't talk about Chevra Kadisha. You don't brag about it. You do it anonymously. But I feel like that's symbolized by the fact that here you have these Orthodox men walking alongside and keeping company with bodies of men or women who are not from their community, not part of their Orthodox shuls. One of the things that happens after a mass killing is money comes to town. People often want to write checks and want to give, so they'll often give to the synagogues or they'll give to the Jewish Federation. The largest Gentile fundraiser for Jewish Pittsburgh after the Tree of Life killings, it was this man Sheikh Khatiri, who is an Iranian-American expatriate, lapsed Muslim, aspiring U.S. citizen. Again, from an Iranian Muslim background, loves America, is a graduate student in D.C. And the morning after the killing, he heard what happened. He went to his coffee shop, he got on Wi-Fi, and he opened up his computer and went to GoFundMe.org, where you can start fundraisers for various causes. And he himself started a personal fundraiser for the families of the victims at Tree of Life. And Jake Tapper at CNN noticed, I think Michael Keaton, the actor who is from outside Pittsburgh, noticed, and it was retweeted, and it ended up being shared thousands and thousands of times. He ended up raising, in a week, something like $1.5 million for the Jews of Pittsburgh. So I like to call him the single most successful Gentile fundraiser for Pittsburgh Jewry in history. I can't prove that, but it stands to reason. Young people played a huge role. This is a Havdalah event organized that night. They pulled this together within about 6 hours, organized by seniors at Taylor Alderdice High School, which is the historically kind of like, if you're from Squirrel Hill, people always say, what year were you at Alderdice? It's their Boston Latin, their Bronx Science, and their Philadelphia Central all rolled into one. And a group of students from Taylor Alderdice High School gathered at that Starbucks that I showed you earlier. It was an interfaith group. Here you can see Emily Pressman on the left. She's from an observant Jewish family. On the right, Isabel Smith, who's half black and ancestrally Christian on both her white and black sides, coming together, mostly female, interfaith, interracial, to organize a Havdalah event for that night. And you can see them holding the braided Havdalah candle to leave Shabbat. They got about 3,000 people, they think, to the intersection of Forbes and Murray. This, by the way, is a full day before the Jewish Federation organized its own vigil. The kids got there first. And this is really important, not just because it gives you a sense of the little village, the little business district of Pittsburgh, of Squirrel Hill, but also because if you know Squirrel Hill, and everywhere I go, somebody knows Squirrel Hill, you know that this photograph is taken from the steps of Sixth Presbyterian Church, right across from the JCC. Why is Sixth Presbyterian important? Because it was the church of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And he, of course, was not a lifelong Squirrel Hill resident, but the last 50 years of his life, from his 20s on, lived in Squirrel Hill. And when he was a non-practicing Presbyterian minister, Mr. Rogers was. And when he sat down to create a PBS kids show about a neighborhood that was safe and where kids could run around and give free play to their imaginations, when he looked out his window, it was Squirrel Hill that he saw. So this picture is taken from the steps of the church where he worshiped. Politicians come to town after a mass killing. President Trump did come. There was some controversy about whether Rabbi Myers from Tree of Life would meet with him, but ultimately he decided that hospitality is the operating commandment here, and you offer hospitality to anyone who comes. So he did show the president and Mrs. Trump around the synagogue a little bit. Here you can see them standing out front, in front of, remember we talked about Greg Zanis' stars of crosses for losses? You can see that he's put stars of David on the facing. He's effaced them he's effaced the crosses with stars of David and written the names of some of the dead, Melvin Wax, Sylvan Simon, Bernice Simon, on those. So there are 11 of those. They now sit right inside some glass doors. They were taken inside so the weather wouldn't destroy them, but you can see them through glass doors in the front of the building now. There was an anti-Trump protest. When he came, they stopped traffic. Thousands of people, Jews and Gentiles alike, came. And it was a peaceful protest. They decided the way they were going to protest was by performing a virtual kriya. This is, the action of Jews in mourning who tear their clothing, or sometimes will affix a black ribbon to their clothing and then tear it when they hear that a loved one has died. And what they did was handed out pieces of black construction paper. And when they gave the signal, everyone held up their pieces of black paper and tore them all at once. You heard this kind of soft, susurrant tearing of paper. And that was meant to represent grief, pain, suffering, a kind of cry out at the universe over what they saw as the president's intrusion into their week of mourning, which we could talk more about. Not everyone was so peaceful-minded. You did get some signs like this, and I include that only to show that it was part of the day, but it was by no means the dominant feature of the day. There was one arrest that day. This is Professor Joshua Bloom. He's a sociologist at the University of Pittsburgh. And he sat down in front of Trump's motorcade and began meditating and praying and chanting. And the police arrested him and took him away. And he was careful to emphasize to me that they treated him well, and they released him the next day and dropped all the charges. But that was the one arrest at the anti-Trump protest. Celebrities come out in the aftermath of a mass killing. This, of course, is President Tom Hanks, the true president of America, according to many people, and First Lady Mrs. Rogers. It's Tom Hanks with his arm around Mr. Rogers' widow, which strikes me as like the most American as apple pie slice of American pop culture Americana you could ever create. On the theme of celebrities come in the aftermath of a mass killing, does anyone know who's the owner of that full, luscious head of white hair is? Any football fans here, maybe from New England? That's Robert Kraft. Yeah, that's Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots, who was raised in a fairly observant home. And what happened over the course of the next year is whenever Jews came to town, they stopped by, not Tree of Life, because Tree of Life was a crime scene, but the Tree of Life service at Rodef Sholem Temple. And they would always come in and say, oh my God, I'm a Jew. I wanted to make a pilgrimage. And Robert Kraft showed up in December on the day of a bar mitzvah at Tree of Life. And he wore the Stronger Than Hate Pittsburgh Steelers yarmulke. And I'm not normally someone who takes photographs in shul, but I thought, here we have a once in a millennium occurrence, which is the owner of an AFC rival team is wearing a Pittsburgh Steelers yarmulke, like a Patriots owner wearing Steelers garb. I think Hashem wants me to take out my iPhone and surreptitiously record this. So I did. And then, because I'm a really good crackerjack reporter, when I noticed Bob Kraft during Musaf going to the bathroom, I followed him in. and stood at the urinal next to Bob Kraft and made chit-chat, during which he told me that his childhood parsha was Behalosacha, and he started telling me all about his bar mitzvah portion and speech, and then we washed hands next to each other. I didn't get any good dirt on anything from him. Okay, so this is the penultimate photo, the next to last photo. One of the other things that comes to a community after a mass killing is dogs. And I'm a dog fan, so this was exciting for me. People bring their therapy animals out. There were actually some official therapy animals of the Tree of Life killing. There was a local victims sort of unit that has victims therapy dogs that help victims process trauma, and they had their dogs out, but then also people just show up with dogs. I talked to a woman from New Jersey who had 6 dachshunds that were all trained as therapy dogs, and she drove in 8 hours from New Jersey to, do her dog thing, which is incredibly moving to me. And if you see, I have to get up close to see it myself. If you can read, this is a little girl. This is probably a day after the killing, I'm guessing, 1 to 2 days after. And this is a girl bringing a note to the police station that says, if you can read it, "Thank you for keeping the Jews in my neighborhood safe. Lily, age 6. And below that is, "Thank you for risking your lives to save my Jewish community. Love, Mikey, age 9. So she's taking a note to the police station, and she stops on her way to pet the therapy animals. And it just struck me. This is the kind of thing that reduces me to a puddle of tears. Just the kind of the love of the children, the sensitivity of what happened, the fact that at such a young age they were forced to think about what happened, and the power of our non-human friends to help us process that sometimes. I will also point out, talking about the police, one guy said to me, this is Danny Butler, who's a local municipal judge and kind of prominent modern Orthodox Jew in Squirrel Hill, 3rd generation Squirrel Hill Jew. And he said, this is one of the first times in human history that agents of the state put their life. Usually in Jewish history, when the czar sends cops, they're not coming to help us, they're coming to hurt us. And this was a case where they came to put their bodies on the line and save our lives. And it's true, 4 police were injured, including 2 who were shot in thwarting the murderer, the alleged murderer. He hasn't come to trial yet. So the relationship of the Squirrel Hill Jews to their particular local police officers and first responders in all sorts of ways was a very, very touching and powerful one. And then I just want to conclude with this shot. This is a guy named Robert Zacharias. He's from New Jersey. Some of his kin could be here now. He's from Greater New York. And he is a guy, he sent me this picture of himself. The challah is not relevant, except when I said, send me a picture for my book, he sent a picture of himself with a challah. But this is a guy who grew up, in the Reform movement and not a particularly religious Reform Jew, a kind of peripheral Reform Jew, always had a kind of inkling, a bent towards spirituality. And but liked being Jewish, but was not particularly connected. And then after the Tree of Life killing, that day, he wanted to go to that vigil, the one put on by the teenagers that I showed you a photo of. And he thought, I should wear a yarmulke to that. So he reached into the drawer that every Jewish male and many Jewish females have, which is the yarmulke drawer, where you put all the yarmulkes you get from your cousins and nieces and nephews' b'nai mitzvah, right? And he reached into the back, and they're always suede, which is a terrible fabric for a yarmulke. I don't know anyone does it. It's uncomfortable. It's hard to keep on your head, but whatever. He reached in the back, and he found a yarmulke, and he put it on, and he went to that vigil. And then some friends of his were having a kegger type, just a big party afterwards, not related to the deaths of the Jews, just there was a pre-planned party that Saturday night, and he went to that, and he kept his yarmulke on, just unthinkingly. And then the next morning he got up, and he thought, we're still in a space of grief. I want to identify as a Jew. So he put his yarmulke on. And the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And when I met him months later, he was still wearing his yarmulke. And I've stayed in touch with him, and 4 years later, he's still wearing his yarmulke. Now, why is this significant, right? I'm not a yarmulke wearer. I wish kol hakavod and all best things to people who are. It's not in any way indicative of how serious a Jew you are in other ways, but it is symbolically meaningful, and presenting in public as somebody, as an observant Jew in that way raises a lot of questions and can be embarrassing for people, and it takes some amount of courage. And for him, it was just his way of stating, these are my people and I care. I don't think he actually upped his observance level in other ways. I think, this is not a guy who started doing daf yomi and studying Talmud every day or joined a shul or whatever. It's just, he's now a kippah wearer. But in some ways, that was the story to me, was the fact that for all of the institutional responses from the Federation, from synagogues, from international communities, so moving and so interesting in so many ways, But for all of those responses, there were also these highly personal responses that were off the grid. You have somebody who decides to wear kippah. You have someone like Lynn Hyde, who lived at Midtown, a couple miles west of Squirrel Hill, and she had always thought about converting to Judaism. And when she heard the sirens going by on the way to Squirrel Hill, or on the way to Tree of Life, and she found out what had happened, that was the moment she realized, I have to be all in. These are my people, and I'm a Jew, and I want to make it official, and finished her conversion during COVID, had a COVID mikveh. I'm thinking about Gentiles like Rose McKee from outside Minneapolis, an African-American Christian woman who wanted to bake sweet potato pies for the Jews of Tree of Life, but had this notion that the Jews of Tree of Life wouldn't eat them if they were baked in her oven because her oven was not something called kosher. And she didn't know much about kashrut, but she went to the Jewish day school in St. Louis Park outside Minneapolis and said to them, I'm just a Christian. I don't know this stuff, but could I use your kitchen to bake these pies? And could you tell me how to make them so that the Jews of Pittsburgh will eat them? And they did. And she flew them to Pittsburgh. They're kosher pies baked in the day school's ovens. And all of these stories, to me, are the stories that you find after the main media leave. They're the stories that complicate the story of grief and anti-Semitism, that present on it, give it a face that also includes hope. And they also tell us something about neighborhoods, about the way that in a close-knit, multi-generational Jewish neighborhood, these kinds of interventions and these kinds of acts of chesed can help a community that's faced the worst sort of stuff come through it and not only survive, but I would argue also thrive. Thank you. So I think I've successfully left a few minutes for questions. What can I tell you about any of this? Do you have any questions? Yes?
So you mentioned trauma and PTSD.
Yeah.
And do you have valid data about the sense of death that's occurred now 4 years later? So how individuals have done that?
Right.
And the community itself, because people are at their best after trauma.
Yeah.
Disaster. So
No, that's a great question. So the question was, do we have data or anecdotal data on how people are faring 4 years later with trauma, PTSD, anxiety, depression, et cetera? The answer is well, first of all, let me give you a sense of what happened. So there were 22 people inside the building, 21 Jews and one Italian-American Gentile custodian, Augie Siriano. But there were 21 Jews from 3 different congregations. Of those 22 people, 11 were murdered, did not make it out alive, and 2 more were physically injured. And then, of course, the others had other sorts of, they had heard gunshots. They might have had auditory problems afterwards. They might have had anxiety and so forth. But 11 dead, 2 physically injured, shot. And then 9 others who made it out physically unscathed. Now, this actually but are those the only people? The first question you have to answer is, are those the only people who might be suffering from trauma afterwards? And of course, the answer is no. In fact, those 11 who made it out alive, in some cases fared better than people who felt they had near misses. So something can be very traumatic is thinking, if I hadn't slept in, if I'd made it to shul 10 minutes earlier, it could have been me. I mean, there are people who were turned away at the parking lot who were pulling up in their cars and then saw the police saying, go away, right? There are people who would have, there's always the JFKs, the Just for Kiddush people, the people who show up at noon for for a bagel, right? I mean, I'm not going to say I'm one of those, but some weeks I'm one of those, right? If you get there 11:45, there might be a nosh, there might be some food, right? So this is true at Tree of Life as well. And what's it like to be someone who thinks, what's it like to deal with the guilt of thinking, if I'd shown up in time for the Torah reading instead of just in time to schnorr a bagel, I'd be dead. I mean, the people who are killed are the people who show up to make the minyan. They were the ones who were there early, including 2 disabled brothers without whom they wouldn't make the minyan on Saturday mornings, right? The Rosenthal boys were always there, and they're among the dead. And the people who go to the JCC and do their exercise first and watch their Chris Hayes on, MSNBC and show up at 11:40, they survived. So there are a lot of complicated feelings in the aftermath of something like this. I don't believe there's been a study on sort of the wellness or health level of greater Pittsburgh in the aftermath of this. What I will say, my book has a lot on this question in two ways. Number one, Pittsburgh is actually a place, and Squirrel Hill, being a middle class and to some extent Jewish community, not surprisingly, there's a lot of mental health services. It's a place you can find a therapist. Let's put it that way. You want to go into analysis? Squirrel Hill's not the worst community to live in. So a lot of the people who were affected in one way or another, directly or peripherally, were people who knew how to access mental health services. And then there were a lot of other services that came to town. And then, and this is a different question, there is a lot of federal money that now comes to places that have had mass disasters. There's Department of Justice grant programs that will send millions of dollars to promote mental health in the aftermath of these kinds of tragedies. And the question of whether that money is necessary or well spent is a question I'm very, very interested in, because it seemed to me that certainly everyone who wanted some sort of professional help got it very, very quickly. There were multiple support groups, there were multiple social service agencies, Jewish Children and Family Services in Pittsburgh, I think it now goes by Jewish Family and Community Services, big mental health agency and social work agency. So there was no shortage of help. My sense is that the Pittsburgh community did much better than many other communities because there was a very good and strong web of supports already in place for them. It's a good question. What else can I tell you? Yeah.
So you spoke about the visit of President Trump. There was also a visit from the Israeli government, a representative from the Israeli government.
Yeah, I think Ron Dermer came. Yeah, and
Controversy.
no. I mean, as far as I could tell, the big controversy was over Trump's visit. So Robert Bowers, who is the alleged killer, and I will go on record saying it's pretty likely he's the killer, though again, he has still not come to trial. He was involved on the internet, we think. Our best evidence is that he was involved on the internet with various kinds of far-right, anti-immigrant hate groups. I mean, he had the way he found Tree of Life was he had gone on HIAS's website, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society's website, and noticed that Dor Chadash, the Reconstructionist congregation that rented space at Tree of Life, had participated in the National Refugee Shabbat a couple weeks earlier. So their address was the address of Tree of Life Synagogue building was on the HIAS website. And that's how Robert Bowers found them. So given President Trump's specific connection with anti-immigrant sentiment, I think he was a particularly toxic figure for a lot of people who felt with good reason that sentiment was what drove the killer. And they felt that because it seems that the killer said that that's what sentiment drove him. Now, the question of whether, but for President Trump, would this have happened is, a question that is above my pay grade, and, nobody knows, no mortal knows. But I think it's understandable why. The animus was not toward Israel, it was toward President Trump. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. So the question is about the security conversation in the aftermath of this. And so I have now, because I tour with this podcast I work on called Unorthodox, and we do a lot of live shows around the country, I think 3 times we've had security scares at our live shows. It happened once in Pittsburgh. It happened in Denver. There had been some sort of scare in the community that day, and we were speaking at the JCC that evening. It happened in New Jersey about a month ago when there was an alert about houses of worship. It's become kind of part of our lives that when we go and do live shows, we are never shocked when there is a security concern raised. And it's often in this very vague sense of, the FBI says that Jewish organizations should be on alert. What do you do with that, right? Okay, the security question is one I'm extremely interested in, and I take a somewhat heterodox position on it. First, to answer your question, there is this unquestionably jump-started a lot of security conversation in the Jewish community. There is something called the Secure Communities Network, which is a nonprofit that coordinates security efforts amongst Jewish institutions, and I think to some extent non-Jewish. I think they will lend their expertise to non-Jewish institutions as well. And if you sign up for their daily email blast, which anyone can sign up for, you will get a daily email that will It will basically haunt you all of your days because you wake up every morning to this email. It's a list of all of the anti-Semitic things that happened in North America the day before. And, and some of them are just, a swastika on a bench at a stadium or something. And, sometimes you figure that was a drunk kid trying to do the most offensive thing they could. It's actually not about Jews at all. It's about some drunk kid saying, how can I piss off the man? Oh, a swastika. They don't even know what it means. Sometimes it's, specific things shouted at Jews. Sometimes it's Jewish people being beaten up or punched. Sometimes it's anti-Israel or anti-Zionist sentiment that some people interpret, rightly or wrongly, given in the case as anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. But, the Secure Communities Network is a fairly now, by this point, established and well-funded group that also does trainings for communities. A lot of people who are ex-FBI, ex-police now work with them and go and do these trainings. So there is now this whole infrastructure. Like if you are in a Jewish federation or you are a synagogue with more than 10 families, I just made that up, but you're a thing. You have a building, you have a budget. You probably are now offered some sort of free training. You probably take that training. Sometimes the training's not free. I do worry about certain security consultants who are selling training for $10,000 or $20,000 a year. I always ask federations who tell me, we had so-and-so in to do our training. I always say, how much did they charge you? Because I think that sometimes it's a racket. And my misgivings about it are, number one, I don't know what counts as expertise in this world. A lot of people are now claiming we can help give you best practices for thwarting a mass killing or knowing what to do if there's a hostage situation. It is never clear to me what their credentials are for knowing that. And these things are still such rare occurrences. Speaking in the grand, we're a country of 330 million people. Statistically speaking, these things almost don't happen. So the sample size, the N of how often they happen, I'm not sure how you extrapolate best practices for dealing with it. I mean, there's been one major synagogue shooting in American history and several other murderous attacks on more than 3 Jews at one time. You can count on 2 hands over 200 years. How could we infer from that? Who's the expert who says, well, here's how to thwart them? So I think there's a lot of, but of course everyone's scared. And everyone feels like, well, if we don't spend this money and something happens, we'll never forgive ourselves. A lot of synagogues now lock their doors. A lot of them now hire guards. In my own experience, and I've seen dozens, if not hundreds of shuls over the past 4 years in my travels, a lot of times the guards are pretty sleepy off-duty cops who are just kind of chilling, and a really well-armed murderous anti-Semite with an AR-15 would have no problem dispatching that police officer. So I'm not sure what we're paying for. The other thing I'll say is that it is saddening to me how quickly the Jewish community finds money when there's a kind of security concern where they feel like we can tackle this one with enough money, and we have to, but how underpaid our camp counselors and nursery school teachers and nurses and nonprofit professionals still are. So, so we can't come up with $60,000 to pay the nursery school teacher who's still making 33, but all of a sudden there's $500,000 in the community for security. And I just think the whole thing raises a lot of questions about communal largesse and philanthropy. But that's a very kind of broad answer to the fact that, yes, I think there's a lot of conversation, but I'm not sure how much light it has shed so far. And there are people who disagree with me and would give you point by point of all the things that they think it's doing successfully. But I have not seen that well done to my satisfaction. Yeah. Yeah. A local one or a loaded one? Yeah. Oh, yeah. In terms of the interfaith work, I mean, this was a place that was already pretty rife with interfaith work. One of the things that the rabbis pointed out to me is one reason we were successful at leveraging other faith communities is because the conversations didn't start on October 27th. They'd been going on for years. We already had the line I kept hearing is, we already had each other's phone numbers in our cell phones. We already knew the mayor, we already knew the local archbishop, we already knew the local imams, and I think that's true. So yes, I think that work has been ongoing, but of course COVID made a lot of that work a lot harder, and a lot of it became virtual. I will say that interfaith work too, I always have misgivings about, because I think it's often in my experience as a reporter, I feel like I'm always invited to meetings at the local Wendy's or Denny's. It's like the minister, the priest, and the rabbi and the imam are all getting together somewhere to have coffee, and they know each other. And that might be the most meaningful thing you can have. I mean, I think that real interfaith work is actually walking into each other's spaces, is, go to Friday prayers at a mosque, go to shul at a synagogue. It's not kind of coffee klatches of delegates from your communities. But Squirrel Hill has a lot of all of that. And so I think that's to the good. But it preceded Tree of Life. Yeah.
Why is it taking so long for the assailant to go to court?
Okay, so why is it taking so long for the assailant to go to court? Capital murder, I will say, as the husband of somebody who does capital defense, this is something I often will say to my wife: how is your client still alive? Because he was sentenced to death early in our marriage. The answer is multifold. I mean, one, he initially pled not guilty, which is pretty much par for the course. I imagine, I don't know anything. I should say I am unsourced. I have been a bad journalist when it comes to the legal proceedings against Robert Bowers. I have no sources of the DA or the defense camps. My informed assumptions are that he probably ultimately wants to get some sort of plea arrangement that spares his life. One of the things that happens with a capital crime is that if it's in a house of worship, it becomes federalized. So there are certain federal enhancements for certain kinds of crimes. So I think if it involves kidnapping, if it involves perhaps drugs or crossing state borders, certain kinds of murders get kicked up to the federal level. So it's actually not for the Pennsylvania, for a DA of the state of Pennsylvania to prosecute. It's not Allegheny County. It's actually the Department of Justice. It's the local U.S. attorney. And that is because murders committed at a house of worship become federal crimes. Now, this was committed during the Trump administration, and the Trump DOJ, Department of Justice, was clearly going to push for the death penalty. So there was a strong incentive for Robert Bowers to stall, plead not guilty, and then, of course, you can have a psychological evaluation, and you can do all sorts of discovery, and you can sort of slow up the works, which I think is a good thing, because I don't think we should hasten murder trials in this country. And now he has the Biden DOJ, which I think is probably more amenable to a plea deal that would give him life in prison as opposed to the death penalty. So there are a lot of things at play, and there have been times when a trial date has been set, and then it's always kicked down the road. But that is entirely typical for capital cases, I can tell you from experience. There's nothing special about this one. They take a long time to come to trial, or they can. We have time for like 2 or 3 more questions, if there are any. Yes, behind you. Behind you. Go ahead.
You said you interviewed over 200 people. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the congregants who weren't there, or some of those people who know someone like that, what's happening with them?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really interesting afterlife. I mean, these are 3 different congregations that were friendly with each other and saw each other going into the building. But Dor Hadash, they fled to the winds, right? So New Light has signed a contract with Beth Sholem, which is another conservative synagogue, to be there. They are now tenants there. They're not going to go back to Tree of Life if and when it opens again. Dor Hadash is, I think, still renting space at Rodef Sholem. So is Tree of Life. They've all had to kind of reconstitute in exile at different buildings. And I think they've done so reasonably well. I think they had to replace, the people who got killed were the people who showed up, right? There is this kind of incredibly cruel irony that if you go murder Jews in shul at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, the people you're getting are the people who show up early, open the doors, turn on the coffee maker, help make the early minyan, probably your Torah reader or 2, and that is exactly who got murdered at Tree of Life. So it's not just that they lost 7 people in that congregation, and 3 and 1 in the others. It's that they lost the people who read Torah, Haftorah, show up early, can be counted on to make the minyan. I don't want to say they lost their best people, because we're all B'Tselem Elohim, we're all in God's image, but they lost really good people. To be perfectly candid. So they had to train new Torah readers, new Haftorah readers. People had to step up. And in most cases, I think a lot of people stepped up. I think in some ways the largest of these 3 congregations, Tree of Life, the landlord congregation, was hit the hardest, because although they have a couple hundred families on their rolls, they really were very reliant. I mean, to lose 7 people of the 10 or so who were there that morning from that congregation is a real hit. And they were already a congregation that has seen a huge decline in numbers in the past 10 years. So it's been hard. And now, of course, the last thing I'll say about that is you may have followed in the news that Tree of Life is now embarking on this massive rebuilding effort. And they're going to, I think, raise or heavily renovate what's already on the site and open a much larger and spiffier museum slash shul slash education center, which will radically transform the footprint. And I think there are really live questions about whether they're going to be able to raise the money to do that, and also, you know, what community will be served by that, because they are really reconfiguring from a congregation to a public nonprofit, and that's an interesting story to follow. Is there a final question? You had another question, sir. Yeah.
Just make a comment. You know, looking at these other mass murders recently, Sandy Hook.
Yeah.
The killer was a local person in the community. They had the Alex Jones issue.
Yeah.
afterwards. And then Parkland, they had this whole thing with the police officers not going in to help them. And now two of them are, one of them is, two are fired and one is now indicted. It seems like this community really stuck together more than some of these other centers. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways what I was doing, unbeknownst to myself, was looking at, I don't want to set Squirrel Hill up as a model community. The people in Squirrel Hill aren't better. But I think that it has certain structural advantages. You know, one of the police officers who responded was a Jewish police officer who was on the force and was detailed to Squirrel Hill. Doctors at the hospital who treated Robert Bowers, the alleged culprit who was shot as he was apprehended, included a doctor who was a member of the Tree of Life Synagogue. And that was actually, you know, an interesting human interest story about how many Jews ended up treating this, you know, alleged vicious anti-Semite. And the kind of Pittsburghness of it all is a very special thing. I think you can't, if you're someone interested in how communities thrive and how people stick together and how if a bad thing happens, you can have a kind of good response, there is something special about this kind of, you know, middle class, old, intergenerational urban neighborhood that I think has lessons for a United States that is increasingly suburbanized and atomized. The last thing I'll say before thank you for your really, really kind reception today is that, and this doesn't come out so much in my book, there was no elegant way to say it, but there's almost no internet in this book. And that wasn't a choice I made, it was a choice that my sources made. When I asked people about how they grieved or what happened, I would often say to people, what happened to you that day? And, you know, they might say, oh, I got a text message. You know, it often began with a text message or they saw something on Facebook. But very, very quickly, any talk of social media or the internet really vanished. And what they would talk about was support groups, was visiting someone's house, was going to a Shiva call, was cooking for someone, was the students at Carnegie Mellon who made challahs that were delivered anonymously to people's doors in Squirrel Hill. I mean, you realize that the story of the Squirrel Hill response to the Tree of Life shooting is, among other things, a testament to the virtues of analog in-person life. And I think it was one of the very cruel ironies of COVID that these people about whom I was writing a book and whom I researched at a time when they could still emerge from, invite me into their houses and walk me down the street and show me things and grab me by the arm and pull me and say, look at this, look at that. I mean, you literally can walk into the Giant Eagle supermarket on Murray and do half the reporting you need for any story on Squirrel Hill. You will just bump into so many people. And that this community was then flattened into the world of Zoom and screens, and of course they've emerged from it as we have, as they will, struck me as just unbelievably painfully sad, because more than almost any other place I've reported on, they had very, very strong and beautiful intuitions about how to live otherwise. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an honor.